Morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Great. So we're going to be discussing today two tools for developing applications, which is going to encompass the Force.com IDE and the Force.com Builder. So go ahead and get started with our safe harbor statement. I'm sure you've seen this a few times. You can read it on our website if you would like to look at it more. So I'm just going to go through first what we're going to learn. So if you feel like you need to jump out to another session, that's fine. So we're going to go over what is the difference of data and metadata. And that's kind of just for the fundamentals of understanding the rest of the presentation, which is really about these two primary tools that we have for developing applications on Force.com. And there's other options as well. But these are the two primary ones that we're going to cover, is the Force.com Builder and the Force.com IDE. We're going to go over some of the pros and cons, why you would use one over the other, and a couple demos of just using the tools and exploring them. Okay, so this is really focused for people who are new onto the Force.com platform. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. If this is not what you thought it was going to be about, no problem if you want to go or bring your friends in. So go ahead and introduce myself. I'm a quality engineer for the Application Lifecycle Management Group in R&D. So working primarily with the Sandbox product and the new Cloud Deploy product as well. And our team built the IDE before I joined. So if you have any questions about the IDE that I don't have an answer to, I work with the team who built it, so I can definitely get those answers to you after the presentation. So actually, before we jump into here, I just kind of wanted to see where all of you are on Force.com. How many people here have used the IDE? Okay, so a lot of people have used the IDE. You maybe don't know that you've used the Builder, but you probably have. We'll get into exactly what the Builder is. How many people are brand new to Force.com? Okay. And what about just developers? If you've developed something, you were a Java developer before or .NET, and you've moved over to Force.com. Okay, so it's a good mix. Sounds good. So one of the first things we're going to go over is this concept of metadata. Most people understand what data is. Data is the information in the table, like Mary, George, Sally, the IDs, any of the stuff in the lighter section of those rows. I have this little clicker. There we go. Okay. So this is the data. Most people are familiar with data, how to load it in, using like the data loader, or the end users would type it in. But metadata is really the data about the data. So in this case, it would be, think of it as the name of the column. How many characters are allowed in it? What's the type of data? Is it going to be an email address? Is it going to be characters, an ID, a number? So the reason this is important because this presentation is really about configuring, manipulating, creating, deleting the metadata in your organization, not the data portion. Just some other examples of metadata beyond the typical database row type of example, especially with Force.com. So the custom objects and fields is similar to what's shown at the top. But then also things like workflow rules. Your Apex classes, your Apex triggers, Visual Force components, Visual Force pages. All of that stuff is all metadata in Salesforce that lives in your organization on our servers, but it's really separate from the data. It either describes the data or it works at manipulating or configuring the data. So what we're going to talk about now is these two tools really about this, comparing the data and the metadata. So if you're going to put in data into Salesforce, you're going to use our web-based interface. Most of the time, you're very familiar putting in data for clicking new, clicking edit, typing in, changing the records one by one. So this is the record that we use to organize this presentation, for example. Probably very familiar with this. Now, if you want to load in large amounts of data into Salesforce, that's not very efficient to be typing them in record by record. So many of you have probably used things like the data loader. There's other tools as well that are available. There's Informatica integrations or anything that can go through the API. Things like the data loader. You could load in a CSV of millions and millions of records through the back end, right? So the reason I bring this up is to show the analogy with this to metadata. And the Force.com builder is what you have all probably used to create your first custom object, create your custom fields, your workflow rules, by just going into Salesforce and going to Setup. So pretty much everything that you have on that app setup menu is the Force.com builder. We don't always call it that, but that's kind of the semi-official name for all of those tools. So again, that's great for creating one workflow rule, one field, one object. It's simple, intuitive, but what if you want to push in large amounts of fields, large amounts of workflow rules? So like the data loader, what we provide is the Force.com IDE. So the IDE is it's a plugin into the Eclipse platform. So many of you had already used the IDE, so you're probably familiar with Eclipse. But if you're not, Eclipse is a development platform that can be used for Java, C++, PHP, all different kinds of programmatic development. And Force.com offers a plugin for that environment that you're able to connect into your company's organization or your developer edition org. And this, similar to the data loader, is connecting through the standard API for data. This is connecting through the metadata API on the back end, talking to Salesforce. So if you can create a field, and it's going to push it into Salesforce directly. And that's actually one of the things that's quite different. There were a few people that said they had done Java development or .NET development. So if you're using the IDE, or if you're using Eclipse for Java, when you click Save, it's saving onto your hard drive. The difference with the Force.com IDE, when you click Save, it's saving into the cloud. It's also saving on your hard drive, especially if because it does allow for offline development as well. But that's a big difference. So especially if you're doing something like an Apex class or Visual Force page, when you click Save, it's going into the cloud, compiling on our servers, and then providing results back to you real time right into the IDE. So for the rest of the presentation, we'll pretty much be just talking about those two on the right. Before we get too far into it, I just kind of want to give a quick exploration of the two tools. We'll get into more in-depth demos in a bit. So first, the Force.com builder. Let's just go through and go to Setup, see what's possible. So if you go to Create, many of you have probably already done this, but you can go to Objects. Let's just say we want to make a custom object here, going off the typical recruiting app that seems to be used a lot here. Let's say we're going to do position, and let's say you want to have reports and activities, and let's say we're going to make a tab as well. Press Save. It's going to drop us directly into the tab creation wizard. What is a good thing for a position? Probably people, or something like that. Again, gives us all the options for what profiles do we want. Can all be customized. Pretty intuitive. Again, what application are you going to include it in? And boom, you have your custom object. So, super easy. Then you can go on, add your custom fields. We'll go through that actually a little bit later in one of the demos. Allow you to come in here, create any of your, let's say, your Apex classes. Wait for it to load. So being able to edit directly in the user interface with all your syntax highlighting. So a lot of these things can be done directly in the user interface. Just other things that are part of the builder. Definitely all the workflow rules, all the approval processes that you can create, the tasks, the setting up of outbound messaging. All these things can be done directly in our user interface. So now let's kind of flip over and look at how would you do the same thing in the IDE. So I actually have the demo here, but I think it helps just to kind of show creating a project from scratch to see what it really entails. So first, we're going to give it a name, which I'll just call it Demo 2. Not very creative here. And giving it the username and password. And what it's doing right now is it's talking to the Force.com metadata API. So if you don't know what that is, it's essentially XML that's being passed on the back end saying, okay, I'm this person. Okay, here is what you have in your organization. And gives us lots of options as well as to what we can actually put in. And this kind of, once this comes up, it's pulling right now what is the metadata in our organization. And this can kind of give you an idea of what is possible, what can you pull, and what can you not through the metadata API. And I say this now that not everything that is in the builder or everything in the user interface is actually exposed through the metadata API. Pretty much everything that's packageable you can put in the metadata API. That's an easy way to think of it. But there's certain things that haven't been exposed yet. And each release, we're exposing more and more things. So when we first came out with it, it was just objects and fields, and then added on reports and dashboards and emails and all different things and they continue to be added. Just to give you an idea, dashboards, layouts, just to look at what is possible. So we're just gonna select all of these and say finish here. It's gonna take a little bit. We're essentially though pulling down this whole organization's metadata onto our local machine so that we can work on it, on our own. So this might take a little bit longer than I anticipated. Probably shouldn't have done select all on that. If it takes too long, we can cancel it and go back to the demo that already is there. Okay. So just to give you a little more view into this. So here you go. Here's all your, for example, let's look at that object that we just created. So we created the object positions. And looks a little different than it looked like in the builder, right? But if you start to look at it, it's actually not that complicated. It has the same things. It has a label that we put in positions. We said we wanted to enable activities. We wanted to, give it a name. We wanted to what was the sharing model. Those were all things that were asked to us during that wizard. And we'll get into more when we go through more of the in-depth demos of how can we really leverage this, because this isn't very, it's human readable, but it's not human friendly necessarily. But we'll see what happens if you wanted to make 10 custom objects. You wanted positions and recruiters and candidates and all these things that are 90% the same, but they just have a different name. Then you can just copy and paste. This is just text, right? One other thing I wanted to show as well. Is the this schema tab, and this can be super helpful when developing applications. So, how many times are you building an Apex class and you don't know what the API name is for some custom field or some custom object? Or you don't know what the relationship is between account and partner and contact and opportunity line item. It can be pretty complex, and some of them have some weird names. So this can be really helpful to go through and view your schema. So, for example, you want to say, okay, I have account, and it has fields, and then, let's say you just want to have my account names, and if you notice over here, it's building your SOQL queries on the fly, and you can run these immediately. Or the really helpful thing, especially from a development perspective, is looking at these relationships. Okay, account is related to case and has a status. Again, it's building your query here and allows you to build this. So we'll get into this more, but I just kind of wanted to give you an overview of what the IDE and the Force.com builder are at this point. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Sure. If you could come up to the mic and ask it.
Yeah, when you're building in Builder, obviously it's going to create the appropriate XML and you're not going to make errors. When you're doing the same thing in the IDE, are there tools to do validation checks, to check the structure of your XML to make sure you haven't done typos or something like that?
Sure. Yes and no. So with the XML part, not as much. Eclipse does have XML validation tools built in so that it runs through. However, for the like Apex classes and Visual Force, the things that are very Salesforce centric, there is like a code assist that's telling you, and we'll go through that. So like let's say you type in your account dot, it's already going to start giving you all your field names. So it does have some of those things, and those definitely are things that we plan to enhance and make even better. But the raw XML, not as much. However, when you save it, that's going to send to the server and then tell you, oh, there's an error here. So that's what's kind of interesting about Salesforce is that a lot of the validation and a lot of that stuff is done on the server side. Similar to if you were writing a Java application, Eclipse does have some pretty good, even before you compile, it'll be telling you stuff. But if, definitely when you compile, it's going to say, boom, line 5 has an error. Just think of it, that's happening on the server side for Salesforce. Any other questions? Sure.
I saw that you use the IDE for writing the circle statements.
Yes.
I just want to know that if you can traverse through all the parent-child relationships by clicking on it and the circle gets generated by automatically.
Yes, it will.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So he was asking about using the SOQL queries. So yes, you can. I'm not sure how much SOQL people have used, but it's our query language. Allows you to get the data out of Salesforce. And it's special in a way different from SQL that it lets you go up as far as parent relationships. So if you're on a contact, you can look up to its account, and then from the account maybe to the user who's the owner, or then down into the child relationships. And as I was clicking it, it's building that query for you.
Yes, I've used the IDE and that schema tool to generate SOQL. And if there's a field like created by ID, it brings in all the attributes of that related object. Is there a way to stop that? Because I have to keep going in and turning off all that stuff.
There's no way to stop it, but that's actually, so created by ID is related to user, right? So it is going to bring over that whole other object, because on our back end, when we define the data definitions, it really is not just an ID, it's actually a whole other object related. So unless there's any other questions, let me keep going, and then we'll definitely have more question time at the end. So I've already kind of gone over this, but just to bring this in a little bit more. As far as the pros and cons. So you saw that it's easy with the Force.com builder. It's very web-based. You don't have to deal with bulky XML. Anyone can, create the field. Some of the cons. There's a lot of clicks, right? Especially, you'll notice that when we did it, it's fine. When you start creating 30 custom fields that are all the same, you'll notice you'll be clicking next, 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 new, next, next, next. You have to be online. So the Force.com is wonderful when you're on the internet. We run into a little more problems when you're not. There are tools like for offline edition and other things, but when you're building your application, you obviously need an internet connection. And there's no version control. So especially some of the people who have come from past development backgrounds, probably familiar with SVN or CSV or Perforce or different version control systems to allow you to roll back changes and to have multiple developers working on things at the same time. It's not really possible with the builder out of the box. You can use sandboxes to kind of move over your metadata and put it in different states, but that's not really a version control system in the traditional sense. The IDE, as you saw, we haven't really seen it yet, but you can go in, make mass changes, allows you to work offline, so if you don't have that connection, it'll just save locally to your machine. It's just text, it's all XML, so it will work with a version control system. As I said, multiple developers can be working, be collaborating through version control. I want to know what this object looked like yesterday. You can move back, roll back. A lot of options like that. There's nothing built in to the IDE that allows that, but it's part of the larger Eclipse ecosystem that has other plugins. So the same way you could be pushing Java into your version control system, you could push Force.com code as well. There's the code assist that I mentioned that will, start as you start typing. It will be telling you your object names and your field names. The schema browser, which we saw as well, that was what was building those SOQL queries in that tree. And then also deployment options. And deployment is probably one of the biggest reasons why people use the IDE. So how many people have deployed Apex code into an organization? Okay. So you probably noticed one of the first things people realize when they start doing Apex is, why is there no new button in production? So if you haven't experienced that yet, it's by design. We have you create a sandbox or use a developer edition org where you actually do your development. And then once it is written, fully tested, we enforce the testing. You do have to put in unit tests. Then you can use the metadata API to do the deployment into production. And until Winter 10, the IDE was probably the easiest way to do that. So you would pull down all your metadata and then deploy that XML into another organization. We're not really going to get into that in this presentation. If we have time, we can look at it. But that's really something that's more about deployment rather than the building of the application. But if we have some time, we can go into that as well. I just want to mention that I said until Winter 10. So now there's the option of cloud deploy. Has anyone used Cloud Deploy yet? One person, great. Or two. So that's a product that my team has built to do all the deployments completely in the cloud. So no pulling down of metadata. You could be right in your organization and push it from one organization to another. So great things about IDE, but there's some bad things. It's another download. So you do have to download Eclipse. It's a third-party application. It is free. It's an open-source application. But it's one more thing to install, and then you have to install our plugin. And as you saw, some of that XML can be a little cumbersome. It's human-readable, but not human-friendly. And not as easy. It's much easier to manipulate something that you already know what it looks like rather than to be writing it from scratch. We went over this kind of as well a little bit, but just to talk about the use cases. So if you're going to be doing your day-to-day stuff, use the builder. And this is one thing I hope you get out of this, is that these tools are not, I'm not trying to say one is better than the other. They're both good, and they just have different use cases. I use the two at the same time. I'll be going into the builder, save it, then refresh the project back into Eclipse, and then send it back and forth. They just have different use cases. So day-to-day stuff, building fields, you want the interface. You don't want to have to get into that XML. Where's the IDE? Those large, repetitive changes, making similar fields, especially if you're going to be doing programmatic development. So the Apex code, the Visual Force. Again, working offline, and then all of the advantage of the version control. So going to jump into some demos, unless anyone has any questions at this point. No. Okay. So let's take that object that we created, and let's just, I was talking about it's kind of a little bit of a pain to start creating a lot of custom fields that are repetitive. So let's see how that is in action. So we have our object, and what was it? Position. And we already have our standard fields on it, position, name, but we want to start making some custom fields. And let's just use a text field. What is something a position would have? What was that? Salary, all right. Hopefully they're not making more than 10 figures. And that's probably required field. And we're going to go save and new. So that's one field. We want to do, let's say, another text field. Title. A little easier to see now. Okay, so as you see, we're starting to create our where are they? Our fields on here. We can go into here. Easy. They're already on the page layout. Great. Now let's go over to the IDE and how would we do the same thing? So we made changes in our organization on the builder side. So we need to let Eclipse know, or the IDE know, that these changes are in place. So go on here, right-click, force.com, refresh from server. So it's going to do a similar thing it was doing before, and it's going to start pulling down the latest information. You can also do this at an object level. So let's say you just want the custom objects or you just want the classes. You can do that. That's probably what I should have done in this case. So the more things you select in that original piece, the longer it will take. There's a lot of text that has to be computed. So as I go on, I'll remember not to do that. Come on. Okay. So now we go back to our object here and position object. Oh, yeah. So here we go. We have our field called title. Wait, where is it? So, oh, wait, here they are. So our two things, we have the salary, and then we have the title. So let's say we want to add in two more fields, and you'll see how much faster this is now. What's something else that's a position? Anyone? The date. All right. So this is where one of the things I'm like thinking, okay, does this date look any different than text? So we will see. As far as the XML schema, so this. So now we're going to save it, and you'll see down at the bottom, that little tiny bar is doing. It's saving back to the server right now. Oops, and it gave an error. And I think it's probably because I have a length. Yes. So you were asking, does it do validation? So as you see, no, it didn't do it on the client side because it was valid XML from an XML standpoint. But how do you really have a length on a date? So there we go. And we can go back into the org. And notice now you have a start date field. So you saw kind of creating one field in the metadata API or in the IDE. It's slightly cumbersome. But what if you would think how helpful that would be if you were going to be creating 50 fields, all the same? You know, start date 1, start date 2, start date 3, start date 4, or whatever repetitive field you have. Or especially if you're going to be moving stuff from one organization to another. So let's say you build something in your developer edition org, and you want to move that over to a sandbox, and then you want to push that into production. Or then you want to move from your UAT environment back to production, or whatever you're doing. You can do all this with this XML. And the IDE has all those deployment options that lets you push the data between, or the metadata between your organizations. Or you can even, as I showed you there, copy and paste just that text, and it'll get applied when you save it. So, what was the next thing I was going to talk about? Okay, so building Visualforce pages and Apex classes. So the IDE, I'm sorry, not the IDE. The Force.com builder actually has some pretty good web-based tools for doing your Visualforce and your Apex development. So we'll just kind of go and take a look at that and see what those look like. So if we edit, let's say we're just going to edit a class that I already have. Showed you this before, how it has all the syntax highlighting already in there. If I'm going to go in here and add an additional field, name, I quick save it. It's pretty easy to go in and just be able to save it on the fly, quick, go back and forth, these fast little changes. Similarly, if you go under the pages, this one's probably slightly more exciting. So if you're going to be building a Visualforce page, as you're typing, it's automatically doing your content assist here, giving you all the possible options. So let's say that we want page block followed by a page block section followed by an input field. Notice for XML attributes as well, automatically being populated there. Oops. Oh, and then I also want to make sure I go over so there's this builder here on the setup side. What's really cool is that you can then take, oops. Let's say you're on an account. And you want to actually see this Visualforce page. Oh, okay. It's a little weird of a page. I have, but notice that's that account name that I just added, the account field. But what's great is that you can be viewing the code at the same time you're viewing the page. So here's that same code I was just typing, and let's say instead of that being the account name, I wanted it to be the industry. And save it right there, and it's going to change right on the fly and be able to see that in real time. So I personally like the Visualforce editor on the builder. I think is great because it's giving you that code assist right away. Now we'll go to the IDE and I'll show you the Apex class editor, which I think is a little better there. So as I said, there's pros and cons of each of them. So let's go and pull that class that we're working on here. And this time should be faster. I'm just going to pull the class, just the classes. Okay. And I think it was the account wrapper I think we were working on. So again, there's that class name that we were talking about. Let's say we're going to start working with this account object, and notice it's automatically giving you all the fields here. This can be really helpful and can speed up your development time. So maybe you want the created date, or it'll let you in any of the things like if I start typing in contact, it'll know all the fields right away. So then the Visualforce one doesn't actually have this yet. But you can kind of see how you could do a lot of your hardcore logic development of the Apex and the IDE. And then if you want that WYSIWYG, not really WYSIWYG, but split screen of being able to view the code at the same time as the page for Visualforce, flip back over into the browser. But again, you can see how you can kind of flip back and forth and do these at the same time. So we kind of went through the understanding of a schema previously when I introduced it. We can dive into that a little bit more, and I think there was still some questions about how that works with Sockle. But first, I wanted to just go over where does that information come from, and what if you are in the browser, how do you get to that information? So when you're building, as you probably know, you do have to work with the API names or the developer names, which is that __C that you see a lot of times, meaning like a custom field, or for the standard fields, we have our own names. So again, if we are, let's say, what do we have? think I have a... No. Let's go back to our position again we've been working on. And, for example, let's create a relationship from that position into maybe a... I don't know. Let's hook it into an account. So we're going to build a lookup relationship. And so maybe the account would be the company. Save it. So now you have this relationship in the database between the position looking up to the account, and we're going to call it the company. So we look at that field that we just created. It has some information on here. API name is one of the most important ones when you're doing development. This is going to tell you how do you uniquely identify this field. So you're going to position was the name of the object, so you're going to position _ C dot company _ C. Pretty straightforward. But then, so that's looking up into the account. But what happens if the account wants to look down into the, back into the position? So you have multiple child objects. So that information is down here, and these are your child relationship names. So it's positions, which, as you probably know, you'll actually, it doesn't list it here, but it actually has like an __R under that. So that's defining that relationship. So this will probably make a little more sense when we show it in the IDE. So this is just showing you this is how you would get to this information in the builder. But let's say you wanted to go back, and we're going to open up the schema again. And let's refresh it. So we're going to look again at account. And we're going to look at this child relationships section. And we called it positions. And notice you have the position object here, and then you can see all the fields. So if you were going to create a query, it'll create it right on demand for you. So you want to say, I want, let's get our fields here. I want the name of the account, and I want all the position names and salaries underneath it. You'll notice it's building your query here. It's saying select the name, and then a sub-query, select the name and the salary for positions, and then run that from account. So we won't have anything here. Well, we'll have the accounts, but there's no positions underneath them at this point. But this can be really powerful when you're developing, because some of these, first time you start working with SOCL, it can be a little strange. Once getting your head around the relationships, especially if you came from a SQL background. But there's a lot of analogies between them as well. So again, this build, then there's, is there anything else in here to show? So there's all the labels, the access levels. So some of the letting you know, is it creatable, queryable, updatable, what labels are on here, what are the URLs if you need to get to them. So this is all stuff that's coming out of the API, but it's just showing it in a graphical way. And while we're still in the IDE, the last thing I wanted to show is running Apex tests. So I mentioned that when you're writing Apex code, that you have to write Apex tests as well before you deploy into production. This is one of the areas I think where the IDE really shines, is that you can run the test directly in your development environment. If there's an error, jumping right into the code. So let's take a look at a test. Oops. I can save that. So for example, here's an Apex class that's just a data structure of a person. And essentially what it's doing is it's saying, okay, I want a person could either be a contact or an account, and I want to just treat them as this generic object because I'm going to put it on my Visual Force page, and I don't care which one I'm using. So not to really get into the apex of it, but just to kind of explain what that's going on. And then in order to push this in production, I need a test. So I have an apex test that is going to try constructing it from a contact, try constructing it from a lead, and then assert that the behavior is correct. So to run this test, it's very simple. We come in here and go to our force.com menu again and run tests. And this Apex runner comes up. Great, we have 100% code coverage. No problems. This isn't too exciting, so let's do one that maybe let's have an error. So let's change our test to, instead of the email being null, let's put in some value. We save that to the server. And run the test again. We should have an error this time. And tells us system exception, the assertion failed. We were expecting 1, 2, 3, 4, but we got null. You can then click right into the... Works a little bit. Let me not have this maximized here. Click on here, boom, it goes directly into the line number where the problem is. Also has access into your debug log, so you can see exactly what was happening during the test. It could be extremely helpful when trying to track down some bug or understand the flow of the code. Also, your code coverage results, which when you're trying to meet that 75% is really, really important. And also, if you just want to be able to run Apex code on the fly, you don't want to have to build a class. You just want to test something out. How does something work? You could, come in here and say, system. This is just a simple, essentially a system out type of statement, and there you go, our hello Dreamforce thing. But you could run a query in here. You could hit one of your Apex classes just to do quick development here. So also all that's possible in the builder. I'll just quickly go through that. Running a little bit low on time here. But as far as our classes, let's do that same test here. So you can run this all online as well. Run the test. We should still have our failure like we did before. But it's not really a way to jump to the line number. But it still gives you the results. One thing that's really nice, I believe it's you click on here. Oops. And you click on here, it will show you what actually got covered. So these are the lines that we actually covered. And that can be extremely helpful when you're trying to reach that 75% code coverage to push to production. You know exactly what lines you covered. It's probably not as exciting because it's 100% right here. But let's say you had something and you'd have red lines and blue lines telling you what was covered and what was not. So with that, let's get you started. How do you actually get started? You want to start using the IDE. So the first thing is you need to, if you don't have a Developer Edition account, get one. If you already have an organization, you have sandboxes, you can also create a sandbox off of it. So the Developer Edition is usually better for if you're going to be working to push to multiple people. You don't know, you're pushing to n number of other orgs. So especially if you're a partner working on distributing an application, the Developer Edition is definitely the way to go. if you're going to be working on development for your own organization and probably pushing back to your production, it would probably be better to be making a sandbox. Then you can download the Force.com IDE. All of this is on developerforce.com. There's a technical library section that has tools, and then you can download the IDE. You have to download Eclipse first as well, but there's very clear instructions on how to do that. And then a lot of this documentation, you were asking about how do I know what this XML is going to look like? That's all in the metadata API documentation. So if you really start working with the IDE, I'd highly recommend reading through that document, or at least the beginning, and then using it as quick reference thereafter. So that goes over what is the structure of all the XML, what is allowed, what is not allowed, and what's possible. Also, there's the Web Services API documentation that really goes, that's where everything about our standard objects, how do they work, how are they related, what's allowed, what's not, that's all there. And then also the Apex and Visualforce docs are great resources for doing that development as well. Okay, just to review, I've said it a few times, Force.com Builder is easy but repetitive, IDE powerful but complex. That's probably the easiest way to put it, but really you can use both together. Remember, as you saw, we were flipping back and forth. They're both saved in the cloud in the end. A few more next steps they wanted me to cover. So if you haven't gotten your workbook, it's really good for the IDE. It's down in the Force.com zone, I think is what the zone. And great cheat sheets on Apex development. Also, it'll walk you through the IDE, and it kind of does some similar things of going back and forth so you can explore these two tools together. That workbook, it's really come a long way, and really, it's a really good resource. Also, our Force.com free edition, you can get 100 free licenses. I actually just found out about this recently. It's an amazing deal. You can start creating an app with licenses, production quality. So definitely take a look at that. And then also, if you provide session feedback, you might get an iPod. So only a few minutes left. So if you have questions, go ahead and come to the mic. Yes.
I think I have a question.
We have one person at the mic. Sure, go ahead.
If you go back to the Eclipse in the Schema Explorer, I want to ask, can you have some way to get the primary key of a custom object? It means the unique key of the...
So, I mean, as far as the primary key looking up to the next object?
No, I mean, how you can find that this field is the primary key of the custom object? Because
So, I mean, every custom object, its primary key is going to be its ID. So in this case, like position __c dot ID.
Yeah, but in some object, for example, if it's defined by the Salesforce and it has two fields that make it unique, then how can I know which two field it is? Because
you mean
sometimes
as far as what we're indexing on our side? Or?
Yeah.
So the best that you can do really is to see, well, there's the ID that's really the primary key on all custom objects. Then also, if something is an external ID, so if you mark it as an external ID, then it does get indexed as well. And that's going to be shown. I don't know if I have anything that's an external ID right now, but it's going to say ID lookupable as one of the attributes. So we should be able to at least see it here. If I go, it would be one of these. It would be on one of these access levels. I don't have one already prepared, but it would be on there, and you can come to me after and we can talk more, but it would say an ID lookupable field, which means it's an external ID, and then it can be used as, I don't really want to use the word primary key, but it's kind of more of a foreign key that can be used to look up to the primary key.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Sure. You can have up to 3.
You had said this is not a class on deployment, but if we had just done this work in a development account, could you at least talk through the IDE, what you would do to then promote that to a sandbox or to
I'll
a
just
full
show
account?
that real quick. I have 28 seconds left, so I'm not sure. But let me just bring up the menu. So if you're going to be doing deployment, there's this deploy to server, and that's going to let you type in a username and password of a different organization. It's going to take a little bit again. And normally I would check this, but in the interest of time. So what it's doing right now is it's kind of comparing the two organizations, pulling down the information from another org. This one's a little bit bigger, so it might be an issue. But essentially, I'll just kind of give you a preview of what it will look like. It's going to have checkboxes of all your different components. So all those pieces of XML that then you can say deploy, and it will push it over to that other organization. You can even do a validate, which is just a test deploy. So it'll go all the way and then roll back rather than commit the metadata. So it's probably going to take a little longer just because this is a pretty big org I'm hitting against.
If you were going to go to a sandbox and then to production, you do the same process twice? Or?
Yes. So the org that you originally created with is always going to be the source, and then what you're typing in at this deployment page is going to be the target. So you would end up having two projects. One, like let's say you go from sandbox A to sandbox B to production. You'd have a project for sandbox A, but then you'd push to B. Then B would have its own project that then you'd push to production. And then you could also push the other way. Yes? There's no instructions to... No, there was. There was a drop down, so it had... Should be. No. We'll look at it though. Okay, we'll take a look.
Can you show again how to do the Visual Force page editing real quick, like when you
In the UI or in the IDE?
Yeah, in the UI.
So you mean that drop pull up bottom?
Like where it did half, where you had the code and half the page.
Okay, so the trick to that is you have to go to Setup and you personal information and turn on development mode. So if you turn on development mode and you go to any Visual Force page, you'll get that at the bottom. That's the trick on that. Sorry, thanks for asking that because I didn't go over that. Okay. So, all right. So I think. Oh, so here's the deployment page here. So this is what's going to let you then push. So you could say, I'm going to add it or overwrite it or delete it. So I'm not actually going to go through that, but this is what lets you actually, if you hit deploy, it would push it to the other organization. All right, and I think I'm out of time. I have a red light flashing up here for me. So, all right, but if you have questions, I'll be standing outside, so if you have questions, feel free, and I'll get yours as well.